What happens when Hollywood's most unpredictable star sits down with late night's sharpest tongue? You won't believe what unfolds when Mark Wahlberg faces off against Stephen Colbert in what started as a simple promotional appearance but quickly spiraled into television chaos. The tension was palpable from the moment Wahlberg walked onto that stage, and what transpired next left the entire studio audience in stunned silence. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in ways nobody saw coming. Last night's episode of The Late Show seemed destined for controversy from the opening moments. Mark Wahlberg, there to promote his latest action thriller, settled into the guest chair with his characteristic Boston swagger. But something felt different. The usual pre-interview banter that audiences have come to expect was noticeably absent, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Colbert, known for his razor-sharp wit and sometimes provocative interviewing style, wasted no time diving into what would become the evening's powder keg. "So Mark," he began with that trademark smirk, "your new movie? I have to ask, is this another one of those films where you play the tough guy from Boston who somehow saves the world through sheer determination and a thick accent?" The question landed with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, and Wahlberg's expression immediately shifted. His jaw tightened, and those who know the actor's body language could see the warning signs. "Actually, Stephen," Wahlberg replied, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the studio's artificial laughter, "if you'd actually watched the film instead of reading whatever your writers handed you, you'd know it's a lot more complex than that." The audience seemed to sense something was brewing. Colbert, either oblivious to the mounting tension or deliberately pushing forward, leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Oh, I'm sure it is, Mark. I'm sure there's deep emotional complexity in watching you punch your way through 2 hours of explosions and one-liners." Wahlberg's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening slightly. The camera operators, trained to catch every micro-expression, zoomed in just as his famous Boston temperament began to show through the Hollywood polish. "You know what, Stephen? I've been doing this for over 30 years. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in the business, and I've put everything I have into every single role." "Oh, absolutely," Colbert interrupted, that condescending tone growing more pronounced. "And speaking of putting everything into roles, I noticed your last 3 movies all seem to follow the same formula. Tough guy, family in danger, lots of running and shooting. Are we going to see you branch out? Or should audiences just expect Mark Wahlberg playing Mark Wahlberg forever?" The studio audience, initially laughing along with what they assumed was playful banter, began to quiet as the real animosity between the two men became undeniable. Wahlberg's publicist, visible in the wings, looked increasingly concerned, clearly recognizing that this was spiraling far beyond the planned talking points. "Listen," Wahlberg said, his voice dropping to that dangerous low register that anyone familiar with his earlier, more volatile years would recognize. "I didn't come here to be disrespected by someone who thinks he's funnier than he actually is." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and even Colbert's perpetual smirk faltered for just a moment. But rather than backing down, Colbert seemed to double down on his approach, sensing blood in the water. "Oh, come on, Mark. Can't take a little ribbing? I thought tough guys from Dorchester were supposed to have thicker skin than that." The mention of his hometown neighborhood seemed to strike a particularly raw nerve, and those watching could see Wahlberg's entire demeanor shift. This was no longer about professional courtesy or promotional obligations. This had become something far more personal, and the temperature in that studio was about to reach a boiling point that nobody in that room was prepared for. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the studio band seemed to sense that something had fundamentally shifted in the room. Wahlberg sat forward in his chair, his entire posture radiating the kind of barely controlled intensity that had made him famous long before Hollywood ever knew his name. You want to talk about Dorchester, Stephen? Let's talk about it. You want to sit there in your fancy suit and make jokes about where I come from? Colbert, perhaps realizing he'd crossed a line but unable to back down without losing face, attempted to maintain his composure. Mark, I think you're taking this a bit too seriously. This is late-night television, not a therapy session. His words were meant to deflate the situation, but they had the opposite effect entirely. Too seriously? Wahlberg's voice rose, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. You think making fun of someone's background, their work, their hometown is just entertainment? You wouldn't last 5 minutes where I grew up, talking the way you talk. The camera crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. This was uncharted territory for The Late Show, and everyone could feel the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. Colbert, his trademark confidence beginning to waver, tried once more to regain the upper hand. Look, Mark, I'm just doing my job here. If you can't handle a few jokes about your movies and your background, maybe late-night television isn't for you. It was perhaps the worst thing he could have said at that moment, and the immediate change in Wahlberg's expression made it clear that this interview had just crossed the point of no return. Can't handle it? Wahlberg stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The action sent a shockwave through the studio, as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. I've been handling things my whole life that you couldn't even imagine, you privileged, condescending piece of garbage. The audience gasped audibly at the profanity, and even Colbert's practiced composure completely cracked. His face flushed red as he realized this had gone far beyond the boundaries of acceptable television. Excuse me? Did you just call me garbage on my own show? I called you what you are, Wahlberg shot back, now standing over the desk that separated them. A spoiled rich kid who thinks he's clever because he can read jokes off a teleprompter and mock people who actually worked for everything they have. Production assistants in the wings were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but the confrontation had reached such a fever pitch that everyone seemed frozen, watching this collision of two massive egos play out in real time. Colbert, his authority challenged in the most public way possible, made the fatal mistake of escalating further. Well, at least I didn't spend my youth terrorizing innocent people and throwing rocks at school buses, he said, referencing Wahlberg's troubled past with a cruelty that shocked even his own production team. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and what happened next would be talked about for years to come. Wahlberg's face went completely white, then red with a fury that seemed to radiate from every fiber of his being. The reference to his troubled youth, the mistakes he'd spent decades trying to make amends for, had crossed the final line. For a moment, the entire studio held its collective breath, sensing they were about to witness something that would change late-night television forever. You piece of shit, Wahlberg said, his voice deadly quiet, but carrying to every corner of the studio. You want to bring up my past? Fine. At least I owned up to my mistakes. At least I changed. What's your excuse for being a miserable human being right now? Colbert, realizing he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment, tried desperately to salvage the situation. Mark, I think we should take a commercial break. And no commercial break, Wahlberg cut him off, his Boston accent now thick with rage. You wanted to air this dirty laundry on television? You wanted to humiliate me in front of your audience? Then let's finish this conversation right here, right now. The tension in the room was suffocating. Audience members were pulling out their phones, capturing what they knew was television history in the making. Security guards had moved closer to the stage, unsure of what might happen next but ready to intervene if necessary. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to promote a movie that I'm proud of, and to have a decent conversation, Wahlberg continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Instead, you decided to turn this into some kind of character assassination. You think you're better than me because you went to fancy schools and learned how to talk down to people with a smile? Colbert, his face now ashen, attempted one last time to regain control. "Mark, this has gotten completely out of hand. I apologize if, Wahlberg's voice exploded through the studio. "If you offended me, there's no if about it, Stephen. You deliberately tried to tear me down on your show, in front of all these people, for what? For laughs? For ratings?" The actor turned toward the audience, speaking directly to them, with the kind of raw honesty that cut through every layer of television pretense. "This is what passes for entertainment now? Watching some privileged host try to destroy his guests for sport?" Then, turning back to face Colbert, with a look that could have melted steel, Wahlberg delivered the words that would become the most replayed clip in late-night television history. "You know what, Stephen? Go fuck yourself." The studio erupted. Some audience members gasped, others cheered, and the production crew scrambled desperately to figure out how to handle the situation. Colbert sat frozen behind his desk, completely unable to respond as Wahlberg ripped off his microphone and threw it onto the chair. "I've worked too hard and come too far to sit here and let some talk show host try to humiliate me for entertainment," Wahlberg declared, his voice carrying a dignity that made Colbert's earlier attacks seem even more petty and cruel. "This interview is over." With that, Mark Wahlberg turned and walked off the stage, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting alone behind his desk, in front of a studio audience that was still processing what they'd just witnessed. The silence was deafening as Wahlberg disappeared into the wings, his exit marking the end of what would go down as one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was done. In those final moments, audiences had seen two men stripped of all pretense, one revealed as a bully hiding behind wit, the other as someone who refused to be diminished by anyone, regardless of the platform or the audience watching.